Okay, welcome to our third panel of the day, and we're here to talk about policies for a bigger, cleaner, smarter electricity system. And we at least have the biggest panel of the day with us here today. So I'll introduce first Laura Arnold, Vice President of External Affairs, Sustainability and Market Policy, joining us from TransAlta. Mark Jackard, Chair and CEO of the BC Utilities Commission. Francis Bradley, President and CEO of Electricity Canada. And Mo Kabara, Vice President of the Transition Accelerator. And I think we have a lot of folks to talk here today, so Laura, I might just invite you to kick us off.
Perfect.
With some early remarks.
Thank you. So I'm Laura Arnold, Vice President of External Affairs, Sustainability and Market Policy with TransAlta. So we are a publicly traded electricity generator based in Calgary, but we operate across 5 Canadian provinces in the United States as well as Western Australia, which I always think for us as a company gives us a lot of insight into the challenges and opportunities we're seeing in various jurisdictions across our fleet on how things are being done well, how things could be done better, and some of the opportunities that we should consider really here in Canada, here in Alberta, where we're based, to really think about the net zero transition. So for us as a company, that does really ground us as we think about the net zero transition, how it's happening in all of the markets we operate. And for us as a company, this journey on the transition to a cleaner electricity grid, for us, for our own generation, really has started back in the early 2000s as we started investing in renewables. We owned one of the first industrial scale wind farm in Canada that was in Alberta. It's already hit its end of life and been retired. We also, since 2015, have reduced our GHG emissions by 68% as a company, which is a huge amount with our transition off coal that we've completed in Canada and will complete by 2025 in the US. So this is a journey that is really important to us as we think about how do we continue through it and what's the next stage of this transition and how do we do it in the best manner possible to maintain affordability, reliability as we move towards a cleaner grid so that we really enable our economy to be strong, prices to be affordable for consumers, and how do we really do that together?
Thank you. Mark, do you want to pick up from there?
Sure, thank you. I'm a professor at Simon Fraser University, but I'm on leave as chair of the BC Utilities Commission. And I think I want to make 3 points as our opening. One is to talk about the policy options. So we're focused on electricity. We have a federal policy right now. And think about what those options are because we're having big debates about carbon pricing yet again. And want to just make the very basic point that often people confuse that you have to have some of this and you have to have some of that. It's actually not true. You could do it entirely with carbon pricing. You can do it entirely with regulations. You can do a lot of it with subsidies, but they'd have to be humongous, and maybe the Americans are going to try to do that. And so happy to talk. I think there's a lot of good things to say about the federal clean electricity regulation, although I have quibbles with it as well, and maybe we'll get into those in discussion. The second thing is that we've been doing this for a while, and sometimes I notice that we're in these discussions, and maybe it's just because I've been in this for 3 decades. I'm the one saying, well, wait a minute. What about what jurisdiction X did when? And the 2 that I would mention, I had many, and so I've boiled it down to 2 because I've been intimately involved with both of them. In 2007, I helped design for the government of British Columbia a clean electricity regulation. Before that, the policy had been that if you were going to build new electricity generation in British Columbia, 10% of it had to be zero emission. 90% could be coal, natural gas. And so we brought in a policy in 2007 that flipped it, 90-10. And we were told the lights would go out, that we needed BC Hydro had to cancel a coal plant in the northeast, another coal plant in the center, a natural gas plant it was going to build on Vancouver Island, and then a natural gas plant, and these were large, right in the Vancouver area, an older gas plant. And, and so we did this, and prices went up a little bit slowly. I was helping Albertan utilities at the time who opted to build coal. They didn't need to. We probably had more price increase than them, although they had price increases related to deregulation in electricity. And now we're doing another task force that I might talk about later, and Dave Eby referred to that. And then I would also talk about Denmark, that went, and I was involved somewhat in that, from 1995 at near 100% fossil fuels to generate electricity to near zero in 2020. And did electricity prices go up in part because of that? They did. And so the point I'm trying to make is, oh, and so then ask us about affordability. We hear this a lot. It's a big thing right now. I'm sorry, it was a big thing 30 years ago. It's the thing that stops us from acting on climate. So I ask you, if those prices in Denmark are 2.5 times the average in Canada, and likewise their gasoline prices and so on, is energy affordable in Denmark? Or did they instead say, actually, most people can afford higher prices to save the planet, and we'll put in policies that help the people who can't afford it? We won't just treat everyone the same. Rich people, everyone, sees no increase to help pay for getting to zero emissions. So that's sort of the point I'll end with, because the next time a politician or anyone says to you, we need to stay on this catastrophic path to help low-income people, ask them if they have considered other things they could have done to help low-income people and still save the planet. It's not that difficult. Thanks.
Thanks for those stories, Mark. Yeah, Francis, go ahead.
Bon, moi, ça fait presque aussi longtemps. Je suis dans l'industrie depuis, mon Dieu, trois douzaines d'années, franchement. Ça fait que I've been in the sector as long as Mark has, and so you know, bring some perspectives as a result of that as well. So I'm with Electricity Canada. Je suis le PDG d'Électricité Canada, qui était connu sous le nom de l'Association canadienne de l'électricité anciennement. But our members are the companies that generate, transmit, and distribute electricity right across the country. And so when looking at the net zero challenge, and we heard this earlier today, and everybody in this room, you know, has a pretty good idea of what that challenge is. We're going to see demand will increase. It'll double, you know, between now out to 2050, at least, perhaps more. You know, our view is that, you know, the way that we're going to be able to meet that significant increase in demand is going to be an all-of-the-above approach. The future will be, you know, more hydro, it will be nuclear, there will be carbon capture, there will be more renewables, we will need more transmission, we'll need to be more interconnected, and we're going to have storage solutions, and we're going to have energy efficiency to be able to match all of that. But just in terms of a couple of very quick perspectives on what does doubling something mean. You can look at it two ways, and some people look at it and say, it's an enormous, how can you double something? And it's an enormous challenge. But there's also, you know, the other side of that coin is, try and double something in 27 years means you actually have to grow at 3% a year, that's all. But you have to do it every single year. We have to be consistent in terms of making sure that we're building. And there are some enormous challenges to be able to actually get things built right now. You know, not least of which, frankly, are, you know, the cumbersome permitting processes that we operate under. It just takes a long time to get anything built. You know, major hydroelectric projects can take decades. Transmission, any linear infrastructure is just incredibly difficult. And so we need to figure out how we're going to get things built, and we need to be able to do this far more efficiently. And, you know, in terms of you know, clean electricity regulations, and we'll talk about that, but that, I think, goes to a fundamental challenge that we have, and that is ensuring that we have effective collaboration between all levels of government to be able to address this very significant challenge. And absent that, we will not have a durable policy. It needs to be a consensus policy for it to be a durable policy, and that's what we're going to need to be able to meet the challenges of the future, a durable consensus policy.
Great. That's a good segue to you there, Mo.
Thanks, Sachi. Hi, everyone. My name is Mo Kabar. I'm Vice President of Transition Accelerator as our name implies, we work to help accelerate the transition towards a prosperous net zero economy by 2050. And as we're kind of hearing throughout the day, it's very clear that electrification is going to be the backbone of this transition. You know, electricity right now is around 20% of the energy in Canada, but it's expected to grow quite significantly to meet much more of our end use needs for energy, including transportation, buildings, industry. So I think to kind of take a step back and kind of similar to what Mark kind of referred to earlier, looking back at some of the things that we've accomplished, I think on the electricity sector, goes back to that hope word that we saw in the word cloud earlier today. I think for me, having been working in this space for over a decade, and I was in Nova Scotia early on in my career, and the conversation around a coal phase-out was happening at the time by some groups trying to push for Nova Scotia to get off coal. This was like 2010, 11, 12. And it was not even a conversation. Like, you couldn't really have the conversation. And then it advanced and it became 2040. And even though that was sort of seen as a sort of a pie in the sky conversation. And now we actually have a very credible, concrete plan by the Nova Scotia government, adopted by the utility, to get to 2030 off coal for Nova Scotia, go from 10 megatons to 1. And I think that's a huge success in this space in terms of decarbonizing electricity in the province. So I think in terms of how the electricity sector is doing, in terms of why we're all here today, we're looking at the progress of all the sectors and how much how on track we are. Irrespective of the clean electricity regulation, I think the electricity sector has made a really great progress over the last few years, specifically phasing out coal and moving towards more renewables that we're seeing across the country. So really, but I think one of the things that we need to understand is that we have a challenge to clean up the grid, which is already more than 80% non-emitting. So we're number 2 of the G7 countries in terms of our grid intensity for emissions. But the challenge is really also, as we're hearing throughout the day from the buildings and transportation, is that we have to grow this grid at the same time, and we have to manage it in a better way to try to avoid as much as possible big investments that are unnecessary. So we have to do it in a smart way. So the smarter aspect of this conversation. And I think that we're seeing the federal, provincial, and also the industry sort of dynamics playing out here in this big challenge. And it's, so part of one of our initiatives at Transition Accelerator is called Electrifying Canada, which is really focused about creating an ongoing process for collaboration, coordination, and partnerships at the provincial level. So we've hosted a number of provincial tables across the whole country to try to understand really what are the key barriers, what are the key next steps. There are multiple issues, including labor, supply chain constraints, the regulatory mandates in specific provinces. So I think what we need to do and what we're trying to do with our initiative is to create a parallel process with key stakeholders to really put forward, what are the actions that can be taken by various stakeholders from across the country, and really make sure that this is a multi-year initiative that has consistency, as Francis mentioned, because doubling, when you look at it on a yearly basis, is not that big, but that means you have to have a roadmap, you have to have a process. And if that process is highly politicized, there's risk there. So what we're trying to do is create a parallel process with stakeholders on the ground that can provide some longevity for this transition for the electricity sector.
Awesome. Thanks, Mo. The Haligonian, I appreciate the Nova Scotia example, throwing that in there. I appreciate that. We're going to get into some of the things that folks raised in a little bit more detail. But before that, there's a question on your Slido, looking at this policy space in a bit more. So the question there is, what's the key to building bigger, cleaner, smarter electricity systems? Is it federal action? So Mark mentioned, for example, the Canadian electricity regulations, and of course there's others. Provincial action, falling prices of renewables and storage, utilities stepping up to the challenge, or industry and investor demand for clean electricity. So you'll find that on your Slido. And folks, we'll return to the results of that in a few minutes. I also want to remind you that You can submit questions too through that app and vote up or down the other questions that folks have submitted, and we'll try to get to some of those towards the end of the panel here. So Mark, you mentioned clean electricity regulations, so let's get into that sort of off the top. If we can see the 440 graph of where our progress is to date. You know, we know from the Canadian Climate Institute calculations that the electricity sector has made a lot of progress towards reducing its emissions, and also that, you know, promised policy needs to be implemented to get the sector on track to meet the 2030 climate targets. The line graph, if you can find it, folks. So let's start with that. Of, you know, what do you want to see from those clean electricity regulations and investment tax credits in order to really make progress, to promise that progress for the electricity sector? And maybe Mark, since you mentioned it, do you want to start off there?
Yeah, well, if you say our electricity sector in Canada made great progress, I mean, it's really what the Ontario government did in 2004 to 14. You know, that's a huge one. Mm-hmm. And then the Alberta government, so I've already mentioned British Columbia, other governments making sure they didn't build new fossil fuel, but then the Alberta government committing to phasing out coal, and then a federal policy coming along with that. But really, Alberta did that at its own initiative. Mm-hmm. And like those two things. So I just want to point out, when I see things on a survey about cost of renewables falling and everything, these would all be wonderful, and they are falling. But you have to think about renewables as their ability to provide reliable electricity. So for me, it's never the cost of wind or solar. It's the cost of reliable electricity that has wind and solar. So anyway, there's just lots of policies. The policies can be an individual government that has control over the industry, like, you know, Ontario owning its utility at the time, or BC Hydro. It's a government directive. That's a lot easier than when you have privately owned utilities. Government's got to enact a different kind of policy, and the policy can be carbon pricing through something like which will be talked about later, our industrial pricing system, or the Alberta version of that. That's important. But it can also be regulations like the one we did in British Columbia that literally say, you know, this has got to be the emission characteristics of these facilities in the future. And that's what our Canadian energy regulation is all about. It's regulating on the basis of facilities. I would have loved to have seen more flexibility in it, trading among facilities and so on, even trading between areas, but that means it would have been stricter as well. Some people have said it's not regionally sensitive, and I would dispute that. If you were to have, and I was involved in some early discussions, if you were to put that policy in federally, British Columbia could have had the policy reach full implementation by 2025, as could Quebec, as probably Manitoba. So really the reason it says 2035, 12 years out, is to help realize that it takes longer and can cost more in jurisdictions like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Francis, do you want to respond too? Sure.
I mean, the critical point that Mark made there, and that is, I mean, just to back up a little bit, you know, we heard earlier today and that you know, our electricity system today is 84% non-emitting, and that's great. That's wonderful news, but it is not spread evenly across the country. So, you know, to your point, clean electricity regulation, it would certainly be easier in British Columbia and in Quebec, for example, but we do not have an even endowment of resources across the country, and so this is a regulation that hits certain jurisdictions more impactfully than others, certainly. So, you know, we've put comments in on the clean electricity regulations on behalf of our members that go to, you know, the requirement for flexibility, and there's, you know, a number of other areas that we want to address. But, you know, there's a fundamental concern that I have here, and that is, and I said, you know, we need a durable policy. We also need a policy environment that will incent or will not disincent investments. And so, you know, we need to be able to have an environment that encourages investments. And so, you know, we need CERs that are responsive enough to the needs of electricity providers, that it gives the confidence that it is worth investing in, because honestly, no amount of investment tax credits will help build a grid if there's that threat of criminal liability for non-compliance and a concern about the ability to actually meet that non-compliance based upon how they're written.
Maybe I'll jump in on this as well. And I think, you know, it goes back to the foundation. You know, Mark, you talked about affordability. And I do think affordability and reliability go hand in hand as we think about this transition, as we think about the CERs. And I think part of it is actually being honest about and understanding what those challenges are for each jurisdiction across the country, so that we can actually work to address them. And I think that's one of the pieces that the more work needs to be done over the coming period as we look at the CERs, is to really understand what are the cost implications in different jurisdictions across the country, what are the reliability risks that are coming out through the frame that has currently been put out in CG1, and then how are we going to address that? Is that through, you know, when we look at the very stringent draft that has come out, what does that actually mean for different jurisdictions? What does it mean for Alberta, for Saskatchewan, for New Brunswick? We have to actually really unpack that and understand it, because if we don't, and if we simply just look at it from a national view of what the cost implications of the regulation is, we're missing the opportunity to actually address it. And if we don't address it, I think from our perspective as a publicly traded company, that creates instability. It creates political instability and community instability as we actually risk starting to realize some of those challenges without really actually doing the work in advance to understand how we're going to address them. And so I think it's an important piece of work that has to happen over the coming period.
Well, is there anything you want to throw in from what you're hearing too across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I would say, one is this is not a zero emission grid, right? So we're not zero emission, we're a net zero, right? So inherently there's flexibility there in terms of how we're defining that even in the current draft regulations. So I think there needs to be an honest conversation around what are those knobs that we could be moving? How do they actually impact the goal? Because everybody can maybe disagree about what the objective is, but we can understand that the objective here is that we don't want unabated natural gas, unabated fossil fuel production going on forever. Because our goal eventually is a right-sized, clean, net zero grid by 2050 that can meet that demand that is going to come from electrifying transport, electrifying buildings. That's our objective here. Now, how do we actually design this policy to accomplish that? And I think there needs to be, rigorous thought put into, are we actually creating unintended consequences with some of the specific provisions? And if so, what are they? What's the incremental benefits from an emissions perspective? Because I give the example, Nova Scotia going from 10 megatons to 1 by 2030. I think that's a great progress. It does not meet the draft regulations. So what is that actually like? So this is the honest conversation that I think we need to have. Not to say that we can't design a policy that actually is regulation in its essence, as kind of Mark said. You can have different tools, but I think we just need to make sure that that is not creating unintended consequences that leads us away from the path of a net zero 2050 future that we're all striving for.
Yeah.
Can I just push back a bit?
While you push back, and while you're doing that, I'm going to ask them to try to compile the Slido results so we can look at them. So you take your moment, and then we'll move on.
All right. Well, just to differ a little bit on consensus, I don't think you'll always get consensus in doing the right thing on the planet. And I think if we look in Canada, the Kyoto Agreement, the federal government came back and said, uh-oh, we better get a consensus. And you and I have been around long enough to know, I was very involved in that. My group did the modeling for all of the consensus process. And you couldn't get a consensus. You could only get a consensus on doing Rick Mercer commercials. The rest of it, we could not get a consensus. Likewise, when this current Liberal government came in 2015, they tried to get a pan-Canadian framework as a consensus. And when it started to get into detailed policies that actually cause emissions, then the consensus fell apart. Carbon pricing, regulations of various kinds. So I think my point will be, and this sort of reminds me why I brought up Denmark as an example, because I was very involved when people said, this is unfair and is enormously expensive and will affect reliability. But this policy actually gives 12 years. It in fact says that I think 4 new natural gas plants built in Alberta, which are 25% of generation, I heard this from Andrew Leach and Blake Schaefer, won't have to put a carbon capture device on them until 2044. That's a long time into the future, if I've understood that correctly. So what Denmark did is it said, let's get going. We've got some predictability because the policy says, here's where you're going. They started to do intertie connections with Norway and other systems, just as Alberta could do with British Columbia or Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. They did energy storage. They did some carbon capture and storage. They did, they had all of these biomass, wind, but with energy storage. They've been doing all of those things, and they had the time to do it. Now, to me, that's, given where things are now, costs of wind and solar, and linking that up with storage, it's hard for me to see any of the independent modelers that I've worked with that this is an onerous policy against certain regions. But that's how the analysis that I've seen.
Yeah, no, it's helpful.
Now,
I'm going to cut you off just for a moment because I just want to draw a little bit of attention.
No, there's no time for him.
I'll throw it back to you in a minute there, Francis. Just noticing when folks are responding to this poll that, this is electricity policy was one of those sticky bits that the ministers were talking about this morning. Of one of the things that makes it hard is that it's provincial jurisdiction and also federal responsibility. And so, when we're talking about electric federalism in this context, there is a lot of complexity there, and in some ways we're seeing that of provincial action, very important, federal action, very important. What that looks like in real life can get a little complex. But Francis, I'm interested in your thoughts on a bit of a different element of this that we've talked, you were talking about what it means to double our electricity grid, our capacity, et cetera. And so, one of the things that comes up in the context of doubling the grid is that it involves building a lot of stuff. And a lot of what that means when we're building a lot of stuff is that, it's going to sit on or across traditional territories, Indigenous lands. And so, how can we make it so that policy supports Indigenous nations, communities, meaningfully participating in, leading, benefiting from that transition?
Yep, terrific question, and really important, and I'll get to it in a moment.
Not letting me go. Guys, say your thing.
No, just to Mark's point, the one thing that I would want to emphasize is I hope my comments didn't make it sound as though our organization opposes clean electricity regulations. We do not. Let's be very clear. This is Canada Gazette 1. The purpose of this process is for us to provide comment so that we can arrive at a durable regulation, right? And so, yes, we and many others have commented on the regulation so that we get it right, so that it can be a durable regulation into the future. So it isn't opposition. In fact, it's very constructive input that we and all of our members are putting into this process. Now, coming back to your point.
Thank you for that.
Coming back to your point, which I think is absolutely critical. First Nations Major Project Coalition, they held their annual general meeting here this week, and so I've heard Nilo Edwards say on a number of occasions that the energy transition is not going to happen unless it's done in partnership with Indigenous communities. And we're seeing incredible innovation taking place in this space, certainly in our sector. I mean, Hydro One I would take as an example, who've now announced their 50-50 equity partnerships going forward. So any project over a certain threshold, every project in the future will be done on a 50-50 equity basis with Indigenous communities. That raises the bar, certainly, not just in our sector. I think that raises the bar for infrastructure generally, for Indigenous engagement, Indigenous participation, Indigenous ownership. I see the clock ticking down. It says we have 9 minutes left. I can give you 9 examples, and I'll take up the 9 minutes. But I mean, Laura, as an example, certainly, I mean, her company is one of the leaders in this space as well. But we see incredible leadership in this space. But it's born of a recognition that this is the only way that we're going to be able to achieve the changes that we believe are going to be necessary. We'll only be doing it if we're doing it in partnership with Indigenous Canadians.
Yeah. I think maybe just to pick up on that, I think it's a space though that needs a lot more work and support.
Yep.
Because I think for us as a company working with Indigenous communities, we need support. There needs to be support for communities to build capacity, for communities to build that expertise, to be partners in these projects. And there are fantastic examples of communities in the country that have built that expertise and are beyond us in their capabilities. There's other communities that need support for capacity building, and we need to do that as a country. And I think that's where government has a role there. The other piece is in equity participation, and how are we actually supporting the financing that's required behind equity participation? And there's good work starting to happen in that space, but we're not there yet. Where there really isn't, when we think about it from an electricity example, Alberta stood up the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. Great organization, requires you to have a contract behind the project to qualify for investment. We have a merchant market when it comes to electricity. So Indigenous communities participating in the electricity sector and merchant projects can't actually qualify for that program. So as we think about some of these programs and policies being developed, there's a lot more work to do, and that work needs to be done hand in hand with communities to understand their needs, the gaps that exist, and how are we actually going to fill them and move beyond saying this is a great idea and we should do it to actually doing it.
Yeah, thanks for that one. That's good. And I want to make sure we have some space for audience questions, but because it came up a few times, let's make sure we dive in a little bit more on this affordability question. So I'm going to ask for the affordability graph that 440 has put together as well here. So, when we know that affordability is very top of mind right now for governments and for voters, the Institute has done some analysis on this, and others like the IEA have found that on average, the clean electricity transition is going to save households money on their energy bills. But how can we ensure that the transition, that we put the policies in place so that this clean electricity transition can happen in a way that, considers existing inequalities that are at play and also can really deliver on affordability? So I know lots of folks are going to have stuff to say on this. Mo, maybe let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that I've been struggling with is we're using this term affordability to mean a lot of different things within it. So there's energy poverty, I think, is a problem. Our people, like you just said, are actually experiencing energy poverty today already in Canada, disproportionately in certain regions. There are things associated with just general, the politicization of energy prices over the last few decades. And kind of like Mark was saying, there's relatively to other countries, we have sort of a baseline, and we have to understand what that baseline is and how willing are we to deviate from it in the future. There's things like affordability of capital costs for equipment that may give you more an affordable lifetime cost, right? So you can have a total cost of ownership that is positive for vehicles, electric vehicle, but there's an affordability issue of the upfront costs. So I think we're lumping everything into this one term, and this is where I feel like we need to unpack that, understand what is the impact on the lowest income households, how are those things how is this transition going to impact them, how do we make sure that they're insulated from the consequences of that, and then things like the upfront costs, how do we make sure that there are maybe financing programs that can, amortize the cost so that it's not necessarily just an upfront payment. So we need to just talk about it with a bit more nuance as opposed to just like a one term that is also, kind of inflamed right now because of the political climate, right?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Does anyone else want to add that? Yeah, sure.
So I think maybe just to jump in on that, I think what you said is exactly true, and it's about unpacking all of it. It's unpacking, one of the pieces I would say with the analysis is we actually do need to look at it not just from a national view. We need to look at it at a provincial view as well, a provincial and territorial view. We need to truly understand what the costs we're talking about are, and then where they're being realized, so that we can actually come up with the solutions. Because I think that's the important piece. We all want this transition to occur. We all want it to occur in a smooth way. Instability or a boomerang coming back the other direction isn't actually what any of us want. So how do we create sustainable policies that actually get us there? And we have to actually do the analysis to truly understand those jurisdictional and different affordability questions so that we can address them.
Great. Yeah, go ahead. Francis.
Yeah, sure. Just two quick points on this. The first one is, I mean, I like Mo when you talk about unpacking it and looking at, for example, looking at the people who are at the bottom of the sort of economic pyramid, because often I think we confuse the issue of poverty with the issue of affordability, and we need to address poverty as a poverty issue, and divorce it from the conversation about the affordability of electricity. And then the second point is that there was kind of a recognition really in the federal budget this past spring that the move to a cleaner energy future is a public good, and therefore should not all of the costs be borne by the ratepayer, but this is as defined kind of in economic terms as a public good, and therefore public funds, and that's what we saw in the federal budget. I mean, we saw 1 in every 8 new dollars in spending is going to clean energy. So we kind of got a recognition of that from the government of Canada, that something needs to be done from the standpoint of blunting the impact of achieving this major public policy objective that we've got on the individual customers.
Mark, do you have anything to add there?
No, I agree very much with that. And in fact, the figure that you showed, I could have given you a different figure if I took the poorest people and their cost of capital, so I'd use a different discount rate in there, and then but Mo said all of that, and the others added to it. Yeah.
Let's try to get one audience question in here at least, if you can choose us a good one, Dave.
Well, there was a good one there. Oh, well.
That is a good one. Okay. So the question is, how does the federal government collaborate with provinces that have no interest in doing so? Does anyone want to take that?
That's not the one that I thought was a good question. I had a different one. I don't like that one.
I can go to the next one if no one wants to take that bait.
The way the federal government always does. I mean, the federal government has a limited number of levers, right? There's moral suasion can only take you so far. It's the federal spending power. Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other advice?
Well, I think working bottom up with, there's a lot of interested and cooperative industry players in those provinces that are actually wanting to work on this issue. So trying to maybe develop a more bottom up approach as well as to complement the top down approach that has been taken with federal provincial relationships.
Also, I mean, I tend to defend the federal government, whether it was Stephen Harper or in relations with the provinces, but the federal government always has to be really careful. So the whole thing on impact assessment, there was a lot of people I knew who were good lawyers who thought that would run into trouble. And people call me up to ask for advice. I can't do it anymore. Of course, I won't answer the phone. I'm chair of a commission. But on when they're developing policy. And one of the things that I kept saying with the federal government, the clean electricity regulation, just focus on greenhouse gas emissions. That's where the courts have said you've got some authority. Don't focus on things that are clearly provincial, and you'll put the policy at risk, so it won't give us the long-term certainty. Of course, people will challenge you in the courts. So really, the courts have been fairly clear now, and we've done. Stephen Harper did coal plant regs in electricity, but he focused on emissions. And so the federal government can help this process by doing everything it can to be clear that it's staying within its constitutional domain. And I think in greenhouse gas emissions, they're pretty secure now.
And maybe just to wrap us up, as the Albertan / from Saskatchewan on the panel.
Thanks for taking this.
I think though, at the end of the day, I think there's more willingness to work together than maybe comes out in the media. Alberta and the federal government have a working group that is continuing to move forward, working together on areas of mutual interest. And I think those types of processes are happening. So I do think there is more willingness, whether it's at a government-to-government level, an industry to either level of government, there is more happening, and I don't think the situation is quite as bad as it appears in the media many days. And I think you're exactly right, Mark. It's about what are the roles and responsibilities of each level of government, and how do we move this forward together? Because at the end of the day, that's the transition we all want to see occur in a smooth, stable manner.
Well said. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Ending on a hopeful note there, Laura. Great. Thanks so much, folks, for your time and your expertise today. That's awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was fun.
Absolutely.